The neon billboards of Times Square flashed in brilliant shades of electric blue, hot pink, and gold. It was 9 p.m., but the heart of New York City was brighter than a sunny afternoon. Huge screens displayed modeling ads, high-end perfume commercials, and trailers for the newest Hollywood movies. Thousands of tourists packed the streets, laughing, taking selfies, and holding shopping bags from expensive brands. The air was filled with the smell of roasted nuts, hot pretzels, and the loud, energetic buzz of the city that never sleeps. But down on the cold concrete sidewalk, leaning against the cold glass of a closed storefront, sat Michael. Michael wore an oversized, faded winter jacket that had a tear at the shoulder. His shoes were worn out, taped together at the toes to keep the freezing wind out. In front of him sat a small, battered paper coffee cup with a few coins at the bottom. To the thousands of people rushing past, Michael was invisible. They looked through him, not at him. He was a shadow in the brightest place on earth. Michael rubbed his cold hands together, trying to blow warm air into his numb fingers. He hadn't eaten anything substantial since yesterday morning. Just across the narrow street, a group of young friends, around the same age Michael used to be when he first came to this city with big dreams, were laughing loudly. They were standing outside a famous burger joint, holding massive, juicy burgers and large fries. The delicious scent of grilled meat drifted across the street, making Michael's stomach twist in pain. He watched a man in an expensive wool coat accidentally drop a half-eaten pretzel onto the ground. The man didn't care. He just kept walking, talking loudly into his wireless earbuds about $1 million business deal. Michael stared at the food on the ground for a second, a wave of shame washing over him, before he forced himself to look away. Suddenly, a sudden gust of freezing New York wind swept through the avenue. Michael shivered violently, pulling his thin hood tighter around his ears. He looked up at a massive, 3-story-high digital screen right above his head. The screen showed a family laughing in a warm, cozy living room, sitting by a fireplace. The contrast was brutal. He was sitting directly under the warmest-looking light, yet he was freezing to death. "Excuse me," Michael said softly to a young couple walking past, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Anything helps. Just $1 for a hot tea." The couple didn't even flinch. The man stepped slightly to the side to avoid brushing against Michael's jacket, his eyes glued to his smartphone map. The woman was busy smiling for a Snapchat video, capturing the glowing billboards behind them. They walked right past his outstretched hand as if he were just a piece of trash left on the sidewalk. A deep, heavy wave of loneliness hit Michael. It wasn't just the hunger or the biting cold that hurt the most. It was the total isolation. He was surrounded by at least 10,000 people at that very moment. He could hear their conversations, see their smiles, and hear their footsteps ringing on the pavement. Yet, he had never felt more entirely alone in his entire life. In this city of millions, no one knew his name, no one cared if he breathed, and no one would notice if he disappeared into the dark New York night. He closed his eyes, blocking out the blinding neon lights. In his mind, the loud sounds of Times Square began to fade. He didn't see the skyscrapers anymore. Instead, he saw a quiet, green field from his childhood, a warm kitchen, and heard a voice that used to call him by his name. When he opened his eyes again, the giant billboard above him flashed, changing to a bright, sparkling advertisement that read, "Welcome to the American Dream." Michael looked at the sign, then looked down at his empty paper cup. He pulled his knees close to his chest, leaned his head back against the cold glass, and vanished once again into the crowd of the world's brightest city. The white flakes began to fall just as the streetlights of Queens turned on. At first, they were tiny, dancing like white dust under the yellow glow of the lamps. Within half an hour, the light flurry turned into a heavy, silent blanket of snow. To the people of New York, it was a beautiful winter evening. Children ran out onto the sidewalks, catching flakes on their tongues, and couples stopped to take photos, their laughter muffled by the soft falling snow. But for Fahim, the first snow of his life felt like 1,000 tiny needles piercing through his skin. Fahim had arrived in New York from Bangladesh exactly 3 weeks ago. Back home, he had seen snow in Hollywood movies. It always looked magical, cozy, and full of joy. He had dreamed of the day he would stand under a New York snowfall. But no one in those movies ever mentioned how the cold actually bites into your bones when you aren't prepared for it. Fahim was walking down a busy sidewalk on 74th Street in Jackson Heights. He was wearing a thin, cotton hoodie he had brought from Dhaka, a jacket meant for a mild Bengali winter, not a freezing American one. His hands were stuffed deep into his pockets, but his fingers had long gone completely numb. He didn't own winter gloves, and he didn't have a proper heavy coat. A good winter jacket cost at least $80, and right now, $80 was the exact amount he had left in his wallet to survive the next 2 weeks. As the wind blew, sweeping a gust of powdery snow right into his face, Fahim shivered so violently his teeth chattered loudly. His breath came out in thick, white clouds of vapor. He looked at his feet. His ordinary canvas sneakers were already soaked through from stepping in a slushy puddle. It felt as if his toes were encased in blocks of ice. He passed by the glass window of a bustling, warm coffee shop. Inside, people were sitting in comfortable booths, wrapped in thick wool scarves and heavy, stylish puffer jackets. They were smiling, sipping hot lattes, and watching the snow fall gracefully outside. Fahim stopped for a brief second, staring at a young man inside who looked about his age. The man was laughing, completely safe from the elements. Fahim quickly looked down, a deep sense of humiliation and homesickness washing over him. He felt like an alien in this giant, frozen city. He forced his frozen legs to keep moving toward the subway station. With every step, the bitter cold seemed to slow his blood down. To distract himself from the pain in his frozen ears, Fahim closed his eyes for a brief moment as he walked. Instantly, his mind drifted back across the ocean. He remembered his mother's small, warm kitchen in Dhaka. He could almost smell the mustard oil and the steam rising from a plate of hot rice and fresh fish curry. He remembered how his mother would scold him if he sat under the ceiling fan for too long, worried he would catch a cold. "Fahim, wrap a shawl around yourself," her voice echoed in his memory. A sudden, loud honk from a passing yellow taxi snapped him back to reality. The illusion broke. There was no warm kitchen here. There was only the black asphalt of New York, rapidly turning white, and a biting wind that didn't care about his dreams. Fahim finally reached the entrance of the subway station. As he walked down the stairs, away from the falling snow, a slight warmth from the underground vents hit his face. He leaned against the tiled wall of the station, his body still shaking uncontrollably. He took his hands out of his pockets and looked at them. They were completely red and stiff. He looked up at the stairs he had just descended, watching the snow continue to pile up on the top step. The romanticized, American dream he had carried in his heart for years had just been frozen out by his very first New York winter. He pulled his thin hood lower over his face, took a deep, shaky breath, and waited for the train to take him to a cold, shared room he couldn't yet call home. The underground world of the New York subway was a chaotic symphony of metallic screeches, rushing footsteps, and the loud, echoing chatter of people heading home after a long workday. It was 6 p.m., rush hour at the 34th Street, Herald Square station. Thousands of commuters pushed past one another, their eyes glued to their phones, moving like robots through the concrete tunnels. The air down there was thick, smelling of old dust, warm metal, and cheap coffee. In a small corner of the tiled tunnel, right next to a massive concrete pillar, sat David. David was an old man with deep, wrinkled lines on his face that told the stories of many harsh winters. He wore a patched woolen coat and a faded flat cap that cast a soft shadow over his tired eyes. Resting against his knee was a battered, scratched wooden guitar that had seen better days. For the past 5 years, this tiny spot in the subway station had been David's stage. As the crowd rushed by, David gently placed his worn fingers on the strings. He didn't play the upbeat pop songs or loud rock music that usually caught the attention of busy New Yorkers. Instead, he pulled his bow across the strings, releasing a slow, deeply emotional, and hauntingly beautiful melody. The notes rose into the air, echoing softly against the cold, tiled walls. It was a tune full of heartbreak, longing, and a quiet dignity. To the sea of people rushing past, David was just background noise. Hundreds of expensive leather boots and sneakers marched right past his open guitar case on the floor. A few people dropped a shiny dime or a crumpled $1 bill without even breaking their stride or looking up. They gave money out of habit, not because they actually heard the music. David remained invisible, a ghost playing a soundtrack for a city too busy to listen. But then, the platform bell rang, announcing the arrival of another crowded train. As a fresh wave of passengers poured out of the steel doors, a young man named Rahat stepped onto the platform. Rahat was a student who had moved to New York from a small town overseas only a few months ago. His shoulders were slumped from the heavy weight of his backpack, and his face was tight with exhaustion from balancing university classes with a late-night cleaning job. He was feeling incredibly homesick, completely overwhelmed by the giant, cold, and mechanical nature of America. Rahat was walking fast, trying to keep up with the crowd, when suddenly, a specific sequence of musical notes drifted through the damp air and hit his ears. Rahat stopped dead in his tracks. The sudden halt caused a busy businessman behind him to bump into his shoulder and mutter an angry curse, but Rahat didn't even notice. His heart skipped a beat. The melody David was playing wasn't just random music. It was a traditional, soulful lullaby from Rahat's own homeland, a song his grandmother used to hum to him on quiet, rainy evenings when he was a little boy. Slowly, turning away from the rushing crowd, Rahat walked toward the corner. The closer he got, the louder and clearer the melody became, wrapping around him like a warm blanket in the middle of a frozen desert. He stood a few feet away, watching David's weathered hands move across the guitar. Tears welled up in Rahat's eyes, blurring the bright fluorescent lights of the subway station. For a few beautiful seconds, the loud screeching of the trains faded away. The concrete walls dissolved. Rahat wasn't in a dark, noisy New York subway anymore. He was back home, sitting on his porch, smelling the wet earth after a fresh rain. The music had given him a bridge across the ocean, connecting him to the pieces of his soul he thought he had lost. David finished the song with a long, vibrating note that slowly died down in the tunnel. He let out a soft sigh and looked up. For the first time in hours, someone was standing right in front of him, looking directly into his eyes. Rahat stepped forward. He didn't have much money, just a $5 bill left in his pocket for his dinner, but he gently bent down and placed it inside the guitar case. He looked at the old man and whispered a genuine, emotional, "Thank you." David looked at the bill, then up at Rahat's tear-stained face. A soft, knowing smile broke through the old man's wrinkles. He nodded gently, understanding completely. No words were needed. In a city of millions where everyone was a stranger, two lonely souls had just found a moment of pure human connection through a broken guitar and a chanced chasm of a melody. The low, constant hum of the old window air conditioner was the only sound inside apartment 4B in Astoria, Queens. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Sunday, but inside the cramped, dimly lit living room, the atmosphere was thick with exhaustion and unspoken tension. The room was small, with peeling wallpaper and a single window overlooking a noisy subway line. Clothes were hung over the backs of mismatched chairs, and 4 mattresses were laid out side by side on the floor, leaving barely any space to walk. This was home for Asif, Sohel, Kabir, and Biplav, 4 friends who had left Bangladesh together 3 years ago, chasing the glowing promise of the American dream. Asif sat at a small wooden dining table, his fingers tapping rapidly on a calculator. Spread out before him were stacks of crumpled receipts, utility bills, and a notebook filled with columns of numbers. Asif drove a yellow taxi for 14 hours a day. His back ached constantly, and his eyes were perpetually bloodshot from staring at the brake lights of Manhattan traffic. Across the room, Sohel lay flat on his back on his mattress, staring blankly at the stained ceiling. His hands were raw, red, and swollen. He washed dishes at a busy Italian restaurant in Brooklyn, his skin reacting badly to the harsh dishwashing chemicals. He was too tired to even move a finger. Near the window, Kabir was quietly folding his delivery jacket. He rode an electric bicycle through snow and rain, delivering food to wealthy apartments. Tonight, a customer had yelled at him because the soup was slightly cold, and he had been stiffed on the tip. The humiliation still burned in his chest. The bathroom door creaked open, and Biplov walked out, wiping his face with a rough towel. He worked the night shift at a 24-hour convenience store. "All right, everyone," Asif said, his voice heavy with fatigue, breaking the long silence. He didn't look up from his notebook. "The rent went up by $50 this month. Plus, the electricity bill is higher because we ran the heater last week. Everyone needs to chip in an extra $45. A heavy silence fell over the room. No one spoke. The invisible walls that had been slowly building between the four friends over the past few months suddenly felt concrete. Sohel let out a bitter, exhausted sigh without turning his head. 45 more? Asif, I told you, my restaurant cut my hours this week. I barely made enough to send money back to my father for his heart medication. I don't have an extra $45. Asif slammed his pen down on the table, his patience snapping. And what about me, Sohel? Do you think the landlord cares about your father's medication? If we don't pay by Tuesday, we're all on the street. I'm already driving extra hours, ruining my health. We are all ruining our health. Kabir interjected from the window, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and sadness. I rode 12 miles in a freezing downpour today for a $2 tip. Don't act like you're the only one sacrificing, Asif. The argument started to escalate, voices rising over the hum of the air conditioner. Accusations flew across the tiny room, about who used too much hot water, who didn't clean the kitchen, and who wasn't working hard enough. The stress of the missing dollars was transforming four childhood friends, who used to share everything back home, into bitter roommates counting pennies. Biplov, who had remained quiet, walked over to the table. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wad of crumpled $1 and $5 bills, his tips from the convenience store register. He quietly laid them on top of Asif's notebook. Here, Biplov said softly, his voice calm but laced with deep sorrow. I have $60 here. Take it. Pay Sohel's share too. Asif looked at the crumpled bills, then up at Biplov. The anger in the room suddenly evaporated, replaced by a profound, heavy sadness. Biplov sat down on the edge of a mattress. Do you guys remember the tea stall near our college in Dhaka? He asked, a faint, sad smile appearing on his lips. We used to share one single cup of tea because none of us had money. We used to laugh for hours. We promised each other that when we came to America, we would build a big life together. He looked around the cramped, messy room. Look at us now. We live in the richest city in the world, surrounded by billions of dollars. But we are fighting over $45. We are letting this city turn us into enemies. Kabir lowered his head, his shoulders shaking slightly as he fought back tears. Sohel finally sat up, looking at his raw, damaged hands, a wave of shame washing over him. Asif slowly closed his notebook and rubbed his face with both hands, feeling the deep tracks of exhaustion. The silence returned, but this time, it wasn't a silence of anger. It was a silence of realization. New York had demanded a heavy price for their survival, not just their physical labor, but their peace, their joy, and almost their brotherhood. Asif quietly stacked the money and put it away. He walked over to Sohel and placed a hand on his shoulder. I'm sorry, brother. I didn't mean it. Sohel nodded, covering Asif's hand with his own. I know. We're just tired. Kabir walked over, and Biplov stood up. For the first time in months, the four friends stood close together in the center of the tiny room. Outside, a subway train rattled past, shaking the window panes. But inside, the invisible walls had crumbled. They hadn't conquered New York, and the dollars were still short, but as they turned off the lights and lay down on their mattresses side by side, they knew they still had the one thing the city couldn't take away, each other. The afternoon sun filtered through the giant oak trees of Central Park, casting dancing shadows on the concrete pathways. It was a crisp, autumn Tuesday in New York City. The park was alive with the sound of dry leaves rustling under the boots of joggers, the distant chatter of tourists, and the occasional bark of a dog chasing a frisbee. Yet, amid all the movement, a green wooden bench near a quiet walking path remained a small island of stillness. On the left side of the bench sat Arthur. Arthur was an 82-year-old native New Yorker. He wore a perfectly pressed tweed jacket, a neatly knotted woolen scarf, and held a polished wooden cane between his knees. Every single day, Arthur came to this exact bench. He didn't read the newspaper, and he didn't listen to music. He just watched the families walk past. Arthur had a beautiful home in Manhattan and a successful past, but his apartment was suffocatingly quiet. His wife had passed away 5 years ago, and his son, a busy corporate lawyer on Wall Street, rarely called and almost never visited. "Too busy, Dad, I'll catch you next weekend," was the usual text message. Arthur was surrounded by the grandest city in the world, yet he was starving for a single meaningful conversation. On the right side of the same bench sat Tanvir. Tanvir was a 24-year-old youth who had moved to New York from Bangladesh just 4 months ago on a student visa. He was wearing an ordinary denim jacket, his shoulders slumped from the literal and mental weight of his heavy backpack. Balanced on his lap was a cheap, scratched laptop. Tanvir's eyes were bloodshot, staring intensely at the screen. He was looking at an Excel sheet filled with jobs he had applied for, and next to almost every company name, the status read, "Rejected" or "No response." His savings were draining fast, his rent was due in 5 days, and the pressure to survive in this expensive superpower of a city was crushing his spirit. For 2 hours, neither of them said a word. They were separated by just 2 feet of green wood, representing 2 completely different worlds, different generations, and different struggles. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a soft, robotic chime from Tanvir's laptop. He clicked on a new notification. It was another automated email. "Thank you for your interest in our position. Unfortunately, we have decided to move forward with another candidate." Tanvir stared at the screen as a heavy wave of defeat hit him. He slowly closed the laptop, rubbed his face with his trembling hands, and let out a deep, shaky sigh that sounded dangerously close to a sob. He leaned his head back against the bench, looking up at the sky, trying desperately to hold back his tears. Arthur, who had been quietly observing the young man out of the corner of his eye, noticed the heavy sigh. He shifted his cane and turned his head slightly. "Tough day, kid?" Arthur asked, his voice deep, raspy, and distinctly New York. Tanvir startled slightly, blinking away the moisture in his eyes. He looked at the elegant old man. He didn't want to complain to a stranger, but he was so emotionally exhausted that the truth just spilled out. "Yes, sir. Just trying to find a job to survive here. It feels like this city has no room for someone like me." Arthur smiled a sad, knowing smile. He leaned on his cane. "New York is a beautiful monster, son. It takes a lot from you before it gives anything back." "What's your name?" "Tanvir," he replied, wiping his palms on his jeans. "I'm Arthur." The old man extended a wrinkled, trembling hand. Tanvir shook it, surprised by the warmth of the grip. "You know, Tanvir," Arthur said, looking out at the golden leaves falling from the trees. "I built a whole life in this city. Made millions, bought buildings. I thought that was the dream. But now, my son lives just 10 blocks away from me, and I haven't heard his voice in 3 weeks. He has all the dollars, but no time." Arthur looked back at Tanvir. "You are running after the dollars, and I am running after time. Funny how this place works, isn't it?" Tanvir listened intently, the heavy knots of anxiety in his chest loosening slightly. Hearing this wealthy American man speak of such deep, personal loneliness made Tanvir realize something profound. He wasn't the only one struggling. The pain of New York wasn't just about missing rent. It was a universal tax the city collected from everyone, rich or poor, young or old. "My mother calls me every single day from Dhaka," Tanvir said softly, a faint smile breaking through his sad expression. "She doesn't understand what New York is like. but she asks if I ate rice. Sometimes I feel guilty because I am failing here, while she has so much hope. Never feel guilty for fighting, Arthur said firmly, tapping his cane on the ground. Your mother loves you, and that makes you richer than most people in these skyscrapers. Don't let the concrete harden your heart, kid. They talked for another 30 minutes. Tanvir spoke about the green village fields of Bangladesh and his mother's cooking, and Arthur shared stories of New York in the 1970s, back when life moved a little slower. For those 30 minutes, the fast-paced, robotic rhythm of Manhattan dissolved. There was no American or immigrant, no old or young, just two human beings sharing a bridge across their loneliness. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the New York skyline in deep shades of orange and purple. The air grew sharply colder. Arthur slowly stood up, using his cane for support. Well, Tanvir, the old bones are telling me it's time to head home, Arthur said. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small, elegant silver business card holder, and handed a card to Tanvir. This is my nephew's number. He runs a logistics firm in Brooklyn. Tell him Arthur sent you. He's always looking for hard-working kids. Tanvir looked at the card, his heart leaping with a sudden, beautiful surge of hope. He stood up quickly, his eyes wide. Sir, Arthur, I don't know how to thank you. Arthur patted Tanvir's shoulder with his weathered hand. Don't thank me. Just promise me that when you make it big in this city, you'll still take the time to sit on a bench and talk to an old man. Arthur gave a gentle nod, turned around, and walked slowly down the path, his cane clicking rhythmically against the stone. Tanvir stood by the bench, watching him leave. The air was freezing, but for the first time since he had arrived in America, Tanvir felt a deep, glowing warmth inside his chest. He packed his laptop, clutched the silver card tightly in his hand, and walked out of Central Park with his head held high, ready to face the city once again. The heavy, steel back door of Laura, one of Manhattan's most luxurious French restaurants, slammed shut with a loud, metallic clang. Instantly, the cool night air of the alleyway was cut off, replaced by the suffocating, humid heat of the kitchen. It was 8:30 p.m. on a bustling Friday night. The air inside smelled strongly of sizzling butter, garlic, roasted lamb, and sharp dishwashing chemicals. In this kitchen, life moved at a frantic, punishing speed. At the center of the chaos stood Rafik. He was 28 years old, his apron soaked with greasy water, and his face covered in a thick layer of sweat. Rafik had moved to New York from a small village in Kumala 2 years ago. Tonight, he was facing a mountain of dirty dishes. Massive stainless steel pots, delicate wine glasses, and plates covered in leftover expensive sauces were piling up faster than he could scrub them. The head chef, a tall man in a spotless white uniform, screamed orders in a mix of French and English, banging a metal spoon against the counter. Move, Rafik! Faster! We need the dessert plates now! Rafik didn't look up. He couldn't. His shoulders ached terribly, and his fingers were wrinkled and stinging from being submerged in burning hot soapy water for 8 hours straight. He grabbed a heavy sponge, scrubbing a pan with all the strength left in his exhausted body. He earned minimum wage, paid in cash at the end of the week, barely enough to cover his shared room rent and send a tiny remittance back home for his younger sister's school tuition. Just a single swinging wooden door separated Rafik's world from the dining room. Every time a waiter pushed that swinging door open to bring in dirty dishes, Rafik caught a brief, teasing glimpse of the other America. Through that small gap, he saw a world of soft, golden chandelier lights, smooth jazz music, and polished mahogany tables. He saw wealthy Americans dressed in elegant suits and silk dresses. They were laughing gracefully, clinking expensive crystal glasses, and taking beautiful selfies against the decorated walls. A single plate of the truffle steak they were casually enjoying cost more than what Rafik earned in an entire week of backbreaking labor. To the people on the other side of that door, Rafik did not exist. He was just a ghost behind the wall, a nameless machine cleaning up after their joy. By 11:30 p.m., the rush finally slowed down. Rafik's legs were trembling from standing in one spot for 10 hours. His stomach let out a loud, painful growl. He hadn't eaten since lunch. He looked around the kitchen. The expensive leftover steaks and artisanal breads were being thrown straight into large black trash bags. It was a rule of the restaurant. Staff weren't allowed to eat the customer leftovers. Rafik walked out to the alleyway through the steel back door to catch his breath. The night air was freezing, instantly chilling the sweat on his forehead. He leaned against the brick wall, pulling out a squashed, cold egg sandwich he had bought from a street cart that morning for $3. As he took a bite of his cold food, the front door of the restaurant opened around the corner. A wealthy young couple walked out into the crisp night. The man gently wrapped his expensive cashmere coat around the woman's shoulders. They were laughing about a movie they wanted to watch, completely carefree. They stepped into a waiting luxury car and sped away into the glittering New York night. Rafik watched the red taillights of the car disappear. He looked down at his cold sandwich, then at his rough, calloused hands. A deep, heavy wave of sadness and exhaustion washed over him. He was standing in the richest square mile on earth, surrounded by billions of dollars, yet his reality was confined to a dark alleyway and a sink full of dirty water. The swinging door inside creaked again. "Rafik! The final prep bowls are here! Get back inside!" the assistant chef shouted. Rafik took a deep breath, swallowing the last piece of his cold sandwich. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his shirt, pushed open the heavy steel door, and stepped back into the burning heat of the kitchen. He grabbed his sponge and went back to work, a silent shadow keeping the illusion of the bright Manhattan dream alive for everyone else.